You're listening to On the Payroll, my podcast about consulting, project delivery, Salesforce, Microsoft, project implementation, best practices around things like this, and leadership, anything and everything that's in between that captures my interest. In today's episode, I speak to Mohamed Jassat, who is a close friend and an ex-colleague from Capgemini. We talk about his journey from end user environment and the key lessons he learned implementing a massive platform change, moving from Siebel to Salesforce, and the lessons he learned along the way that helped him so much when he eventually moved into consulting. There are some really important and interesting nuggets of information in here, and I hope you'll find it as enjoyable to listen as it was for me to record. Thanks a lot. Hello, Mo. Welcome to my podcast on the payroll. How are you today?
I'm good, Pay, and hello to you too. Great to see you again after, God knows how many months it's been since I last spoke to you. But yeah,
I
great to
know.
be great to be with you.
We worked together and I really enjoyed our time together, and it was altogether too short. So I have been looking forward to this because this allows me to dive a little bit deeper into what makes love and get to know and learn about your journey and the kind of things you've discovered along the way. So why don't we start with just how you got here? How did you get to this current position as senior director at Cognizant? And you can start wherever you want. Either you can start at the beginning of your Salesforce journey or even further back. Just what are the things that happened that shaped the person that you are?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a really it's a really good question, and like you say, where do you start? Um, I think I'll start way back when I started my career, because it's an interesting journey that I took into how I ended up in IT. So probably let's start where I left college. So I'd done sort of my A levels, and they were a funny bunch of subjects as well. So I did economics, computer science, and maths. I was pretty poor at maths, but really good at economics and computing for some reason, strange reason. Even though maths wasn't my strong point, I somehow managed to be able to code and have some fun with computers. So I ended up with these A levels, and I had a chance to either go down to university and you know take a degree. Um, and at that time, I was quite keen on a business stroke IT degree, or to start in the world of work and start my journey straight into a career. So having sort of pondered over it, and with the family, my dad being sort of an entrepreneur as well, so he used to run a clothing manufacturing unit. So he used to sort of supply the sort of chain stores with jeans and jackets and all that sort of stuff. So in the family, we've always been used to sort of running businesses and stuff like that. So I ended up not going to university, but actually ended up working for a company called the British Shoe Corporation. Now, if you're as old as me, you probably recognize some of the names like Trueform, Freeman Hardy Willis, Dulce's. So these were all shoe shops on the high street 30 years ago, which probably don't no longer exist, right? But it was a massive company in Leicester, and they all they had shoe shops just about in every town and village across the country. So I ended up starting with them as a retail manager, trainee retail manager on the management training program. So this is my sort of first, my first job. It was a sort of 12-month program where you ended up going into Birmingham for several months, learning the theory of management, how to manage teams, how to manage profit, how to manage stock, etc. So they trained you from scratch on how to run a large, successful shoe shop. So over that sort of period of time, you got moved around to different shoe shops, working under different managers, different management styles, different staff. And 12 months after that program, you ended up managing your own shoe shop, which I did. So I actually managed one not so far from Leicestershire in a small village called Ashby de la Zouch, which was a sort of small village, and it had a shoe shop there. So that was my first one. And I managed to actually turn that around, that shoe shop, in terms of how much we used to sell from where it was within sort of 12 months to sort of doubling the revenue. So it was a great experience for me, managing my own little shop and being able to sort of prove that what I'd learned I'd put into practice and successfully able to manage my staff and motivate them to sell. So people in those days, the staff used to have targets as well, daily targets and stuff. So you had to sort of, really convince your customer those shoes that they were trying on were really great. They looked fabulous and they had to have them. And also we used to, in those days, it's a funny world, because you used to also cross sell. So I don't know whether you remember many years ago when you used to go to a shoe shop, they always try and sell you some polish or some spray. Do you remember that?
They still do.
They still do, yeah. So we had a separate target for that. And again, it was motivating people to actually sort of upsell, from buying a pair of shoes to buying all the protectors with it as well. So it was fun. That was sales for me, and I loved it. And I loved sort of going for those targets. So yeah, I did that for a number of years. I moved through different branches, and I managed a large branch in Leicestershire as well. And from there, I sort of moved into another sales role with a company called Macro Wholesalers. So they used to basically service the trade, and people from pubs and restaurants used to come in and buy things. So I used to manage one of the departments there, which was again, footwear and fashion. So I did that. They opened up in Leicestershire. I did that for a number of years against similar industry, retailing, sales, and management. And from there, I sort of moved into tobacco for some reason, selling tobacco. So again, moved into a fairly large company called Imperial Tobacco. I think they're the probably fourth largest tobacco manufacturer. I never smoked, haven't smoked ever, so it was a bit of an odd one, going out selling cigarettes to retailers, despite the fact that I didn't smoke. But it was, again, a really interesting 21 years at that one company. It's 21 years I actually stayed there, and again, I started off in a sales role selling cigarette brands to retailers. I mean, the ultimate goal was to try and increase them to stock a wide range of our brands. So each time we used to visit them, we used to encourage them to actually expand the brand range, put our brands in the best place on the cigarette units, etc. So, again, a very sales focused role. And, did that for a number of years when I started out with them, then moved into managing a sales team of about 12 sales reps across the Midlands region. So again, bringing some of that management experience and theory I learned back, in the shoe business, bringing that back in again. So again, went through a number of years there. So I guess this is probably now we're getting to the point of where the intersection happened around moving from sales into IT, because about, I would say, 20 odd years ago, Imperial wanted to basically automate the field sales force. So they wanted to provide the sales reps with a small tablet to be able to sell and to record data. So this was like cutting edge then. And at that time, Siebel was pretty big, before Salesforces, came on the horizon. So I was brought in as basically a sort of product owner from the business to work alongside the systems integrator that we'd brought in. So I worked with them to design a system, a global system, in terms of how to automate the sales process for these sales reps that I was managing. So the pilot was for the UK, and hence I sort of got involved. And essentially, I never got back out on the road selling, because from that day onwards, I was just hooked into in that role of product owner, and being the intersection between the business and the IT team to design and make sure that the requirements that we wanted out in the Salesforce were actually met by the application. So that role went on for many years, probably about 14 years. I carried that role through from system design to implementation to running it as a business as usual application, and then enhancing that application over a number of years with new requirements um, and new versions of Siebel. So that's really the turning point of my career, where I moved away from, if you like, hard sales to sort of, working in IT, but very much a bridge between business and IT. And then sort of that role, moved on, and we then implemented Salesforce I think it was 2000, somewhere around that time. Um, so we moved away from Siebel because we had customized it to death, and Siebel was losing market share at that time. Salesforce was starting to make traction. Lots of global companies were starting to replace Siebel with Salesforce, and that's how I ended up, again, working with a systems integrator to redesign everything again, um, and review all the sales processes. So it wasn't just a simple sort of upgrade, but we also took the opportunity to actually go through probably about 7 or 8 months of workshops to review every single sales process as well.
Can I just ask one question there? Because that's really interesting. What precipitated the decision to actually change? Because if you say that you've customized Siebel to death, that tells me that has a huge amount of sunk cost in it. There must have come, either a specific pain or a series of pain that tips you over to say, right, we got to look at overhauling the whole CRM. What was it that made it so painful that you said, we're just going to redo the whole thing? It's going to cost a lot, but the benefits are going to outweigh the cost. What was it that created that push for change?
I think it was two things. One was the I guess the time and cost that was required to keep on changing the application to meet the needs of the business, and that the needs of the business were changing quite rapidly at the time because lots of legislation was coming in around smoking and advertising, and therefore we need to react to a lot of things very, very quickly. And with Siebel, if you wanted to change something significantly, the time it used to take to make those changes was considerable, and the cost was quite, extortionate. Um, and there came a point in time where we said, look, do we want to continue investing in Siebel and keep on upgrading, or do we make the jump to a completely new platform and do two things? One is not about making a technical jump, because it's going to be the total cost of running that's going to be much better, lower than where we are with Siebel. But can we also take this opportunity to bring some innovation and some change to the way we work? So we did two things at the same time. We wanted to review our processes and then wrap those processes around a technology that would support those and allow us to move things around and react to the business needs very, very quickly in an agile way. And we felt at that time Salesforce was the right thing to do, because the fact that it was cloud-based, not on-premise, it was a component-based architecture where you could literally sort of take things like opportunity, sales, contracts, and work with those components relatively quickly with low code. So there were all these benefits that Salesforce were bringing to the table, which Siebel couldn't bring. And it was a commercial decision at the time to say, no, it's costing us too much. It's too painful to work with the platform we have. We've got to bite the bullet to make the jump. So that's where the decision came from.
So I assume that throughout the years, you've built a team of Siebel experts in-house and with the help of a partner, I guess, to get the changes that you want done. When you moved over to Salesforce, what happened then? Did your whole team reskill, upskill? What were there people who weren't happy with the change that moved out? How was that process of change internally for your team as well as for the users? Because things are changing, interface will be different. The processes that they were used to are no longer in use. How did the company deal with the change, firstly within the team and then as the end users?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we were working with a very large system integration partner, and we worked with them and spent a lot of time around this whole area around how do we change How do we manage this change from Siebel to a completely new user interface, that the end users are going to use, but also the people within the organization that's supporting it, how are they going to get upskilled? So in parallel to the project, we had quite a lot of money invested in the change management aspect of that project as well. So we started very early on identifying end users in different markets that were brought into the workshops. They had a very early view of what Salesforce looked like. And the global integrator that we were working with were very good at producing mock-ups, producing wireframes. So we had some real tangible things that people could click and say, okay, this is what I used to do here. In the new world, I'm doing it this way. So it does two things. One, it reassures people because you've then got ambassadors in the business that take that message out and they can just cascade that to people saying, look, change is about to come, but don't worry, we've seen it. We work with it every day. We think it's going to be a beneficial change. So bringing those people into those workshops, those real end users at the very early stage, really helped that change process. And these guys then stayed all the way through the project lifecycle because they were instrumental in the design, because the design was based on people that were actually going to be using the application on a day-to-day basis, not by IT, not by managers that are managing the KPIs. They're not actually using the application, but the design was based on people coming in that were out there selling at the sharp end of the business and telling us, actually, does that work or doesn't it work? From everything around the process to actually the UI that we were planning to present to the users. So these guys had the input all the way through, and I think that really worked well. In terms of the technical teams, yes, they had to make a change from Siebel to Salesforce, and again, we started very early on in terms of the certification process. Getting them upskilled by taking the basic certification like admin and platform developer, and again, very early on, they were brought in to start to work in the sandbox with the developers, to set up things like profiles, to set up users. So bringing those guys in very early on to work alongside the integration team, the system integration team, that really helped, because by the time we were ready to go live, they were very confident about using the platform, because there was somebody that sort of was holding their hand all the way through. And then that whole transition, moving away, the system integrator moving away, letting the business then run that, and the local IT was a lot easier, because we thought about it 12 months at the very early stages of the project.
That's
so again,
amazing. Yeah.
it is, and I know it was a huge investment, and this is where I think I often see projects fail, because companies, when you talk about investing in change managers, change catalysts, they see that as an additional overhead or a cost in a project, right? But that to me is a fundamental piece that needs to be considered before you even start on the project, to have that change management, roadmap fleshed out. Because if you don't invest in that and you don't have that parallel work stream running, the chances are your project will fail. It's quite high that it'll fail. So I learned quite a lot there in terms of how important change management is, and bringing the right people into the project team, and getting them involved early with what we're building, is the key to successful implementation and adoption. So yeah, it's something I learned, and I preach almost all the time when I talk to clients and internally with project teams, to say change is an element you have to consider. And of course, ultimately the client makes a decision at the end of the day. If they don't want to invest, we've talked about it, we've raised the risk. It's something they need to be aware of. If they haven't, and they've we've raised that, and they're saying, yeah, we're willing to have invest and put that change work stream in, great. That's something that's probably they wouldn't have considered had we not spoken about it. So I'm quite an advocate of that, when it comes to projects, is making sure we have change management covered.
Absolutely. I think what you've just shared there is a textbook case of how to do it. Foresight, the planning, and the management of the people aspect over technology, bringing them in, winning them over, identifying key champions, and then working through that instead of saying, hey, here's a new system.
Correct.
Either you love it or, you don't.
Yeah.
I have a question, which is around data. With so much planning, at what point did you start looking at the data? Because years and years and years of working in a platform and moving to a new one, data must be a huge part. So before your Salesforce project actually kicked off, how much time did you spend looking at the data to be brought over?
Quite a lot of time. I mean, that was the data element was always part of each of the sort of process workshops, because what we had to determine is actually we've been collecting this data for a number of years. One, do we need it? If we need it, how do we use it? So, we had those discussions very early on in those planning workshops, because you'll be amazed at how often companies will just continue to collect data, but actually not question who's actually using that data and what value does it provide. So actually we went through a whole process of, going through and field level by field level, understanding why are we collecting that data, what the benefit does it provide, and do we need it going forward? And going through that process really helped, because we did end up with throwing away a lot of data that we weren't going to migrate, because we just didn't feel we needed it in the new world. It just wasn't relevant. Conversely, we actually came up with new data elements that we needed, which weren't being collected today, which the business needed because they needed that insight to be able to plan for the future. So it's a two-way thing. It's about seeing where you are today and getting rid of the data you don't need, and also looking ahead at your business and understanding what data you're going to need and making plans to make sure that data's ready for collection, or at least the ability to collect that data is there. So we did that exercise through the workshops, and there's always a data stream within that workshop. However, even with that level of planning, I think one of the most difficult aspects of the project was data. And data migration, I think people underestimate the level of effort that's required when you're moving large volumes of data from a legacy system to a brand new application, and how that data then translates through. So it's not just a case of lift and shift a piece of data. It's about, well, actually that phone number is stored in this format. In the new system, it's in a different format. So how are you going to translate that? And how's that going to map across? And again, we were amazed amount of time and effort that went into the data migration and aspect of that project. More so because, again, I came from the business side, and I didn't appreciate how much time that would take, just to do the migration. So it's something that, again, from experience, when I look at projects, it's a stream that's often sort of tucked away. Nobody really wants to talk about data migration, and I always worry about it. It's something keeps you up at night thinking, we've got all this data, we've got to move for this client. How are we going to do it? What are the tools? Do they need it? How is it going to be transformed and extracted? What tools are we going to use to do that? So yeah, one thing I did learn was, although you did a great job of planning the data, actually moving it technically is a different kettle of fish. And it's again a danger area for a project, because it could ultimately be the thing that actually means your project fails, because you've actually not thought about how you're going to bring that data through. You then end up, your data just doesn't transpose properly. So again, from day one, when the end user logs into a nice shiny application and they see the data's not right, straight away you've lost them, right? You've lost the entire audience, because they don't have the confidence in your system.
Correct.
Yeah. So yeah, again, I learned a lot around data, because it's a subject that is often, like I said, put down the list. We'll talk about that later. That's the last thing in the project. Actually, it's the first thing in the project you need to think about. Yeah,
I totally agree. And I think when you say data migration, correct me if I'm wrong, but a big part of it, the messy part of it, is actually the cleaning and the deduping, which the responsibility should sit, actually it must sit with the client, because that's their data, they own it, they know what's best to do with it. And in a lot of projects that I see, they haven't twigged that it sits on their lap.
Yeah.
And it kind of shifted to the partner to say, you need to do most of it, but the challenge then is to the cleaning part and the decision making part, which should be with the client.
Absolutely.
So I totally appreciate it. I think we can talk about this for ages, but
Oh gosh, yeah.
I
It's a
will
subject in its own right, to be honest.
absolutely, maybe we'll have one just on that alone. But I'll let you continue. So you were at Imperial and now you're moving to a GSI. Tell
Yes,
me about the
I moved to
transition.
God. That so after 21 years working for a tobacco company, it was time to I felt it was time to move, and also sort of working with other GSIs. So I was on the other side of the table as a client, right? So I was sort of working with a number of different GSIs as well. So it just through conversation appealed to me. Actually, I've probably got as far as I can within an end user environment from the role that I was doing. So the only way I was going to really progress and widen my horizons, use my skills in a much across industry and with different clients was to move, and that's where I sort of made the jump into working for a global GSI. So that was my first move into that, probably now 9 years ago, that I moved into the world of consulting and GSIs, and I work for a number of the large players, the top 4 or 5. And we've been together at Capgemini as well, working together there. So I work for the likes of Accenture as well, etc. So yeah, so my world has revolved over the last 9 years, really using that experience that I'd built up, from the day that I left college, using that management experience, using that business and project experience to, helping other clients to achieve their goals. And I've been doing that for 9 years with Salesforce. So yeah.
So how did you feel moving from an end client to, it's quite a different role
It's a very
working with
different role.
Mm.
Yeah. But I found that, I mean, having worked as an end client and working in business, I think it gave me an edge, because I really understood that when a client is really passionate about having something, it's not because they're being difficult. It's because really they need that for their business to be successful. And understanding how you deal with different stakeholders within a business, because each stakeholder really is really looking at their aspect of the business, not the wider business. So if you talk to marketing, they've got this, they're just focused on, this is what I need to get my marketing done, and this is what I need to get my marketing job done. If you talk to finance, they've got their own set of requirements. If you go and talk to sales, they've got their own set of requirements. So you've got to understand that, and appreciate that within a large global business, different stakeholders have different requirements, and your job is how do you bring those together? Because sometimes there's going to be conflict in terms of somebody asking for X, somebody wants Y, and how do you sort of reconcile that? One, to make sure that you're giving them what they want, but also doing that efficiently on a platform like Salesforce. Sticking to the core concepts of, uh, out of the box design, rather than sort of customizing if you can avoid it. So all of those design considerations from different stakeholders with their business is quite important to appreciate, and not just think on a project, well, someone's just being difficult, because they're not being difficult. That's probably a genuine requirement in order for them to achieve their objectives for that part of the business. And having worked as an end user, on the sort of client side, I really appreciated that, right? So and it also gave me an appreciation of actually going and asking really deep questions about what people want. Because I think you and I know, Pei, having worked in this industry for a number of years, that when a customer gives you a requirement, unless you're really cute and you can really sort of dig down into that requirement, you're just listening to a superficial requirement. And you and I can take that away and interpret that how we want. A developer can interpret it one way, you can interpret it a different way, a tester can interpret it a different way. And in the end, what you end up with actually is delivering something that actually the client really didn't want, or it's not quite what they wanted. Now, that's the skill, right? So, as a client, don't always assume the client is going to be, really defining that requirement to the nth level, because they're assuming a lot of things that you understand that because you have the industry knowledge, you work with multiple clients. But actually, unless you actually really probe and really ask what that requirement means, you actually end up designing a system that people don't really want, or that it's not met their requirement. So again, coming back to the experience I had, on the business side, what I'd learned is actually never assume that the integrator, the system integrator, understands what you're saying. So I always made a habit of documenting my requirements to a level that we both understood, going through those in detail, etc. And again, that's helped me, moving away from end user to consulting, because again, I tend to, you'll get a set of requirements in a spreadsheet, which is 2 or 3 sentences per requirement, a user story. I mean, user stories are great, don't get me wrong, but they don't give you the context and the level of requirements you really need to translate that user story to a developer. So again, it's taught me, user stories are basis for a requirement, but you cannot design off a user story. You've got to really probe down, really understand what that requirement means, and fill the gaps before you go off and give it to a developer. So again, with a lot of projects and clients that I've worked with in the past, we start with a base requirement, but it actually then, evolves and refines, and you end up, getting the right people together to really understand what that customer wants, what that client wants with that set of requirements. And again, having the appreciation and having learned that from a business perspective, I can understand that that's quite important for a project to be successful. And you and I have both seen Pay where we've got requirements that you think, what does that mean? How am I going to be able to give this to a developer to develop? Because it's just too vague. Doesn't give you any context. So I think, there's a lot of those sort of things that I've really taken from the days that I worked at 20 odd years in the tobacco industry to working now for GSIs, and having the appreciation really of what position the client's in, and where the GSI is. And the other thing I will say is the client doesn't really always know the answer either sometimes, because you're always assuming they're giving you the answer. They're very clear about the requirement. The chances are, if you really ask the question, they probably don't know what their requirement is. They sort of know what they want, but if it's something new, they probably have a vision or a picture in their head, but they really don't know what the detail of that requirement is. And until you have that discussion with them, you're not going to get really to a point where you're trying to meet that requirement to 100%, because you're making a lot of guesses along the way.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me flip the question around slightly now. Is there anything you miss from working with an end client that obviously we don't get working as a consulting partner? Is there anything that you miss from that world?
I guess I miss the fact that I can offload a lot of the responsibility as a client to a GSI, and that's what I'm paying the GSI for, is to bring the innovation, the responsibility to give me a fully tested and working solution at the end. Giving the headache of data migration over to somebody else to some degree, right? So I guess I missed that, because I never used to appreciate that as a client. Yeah, it's like, you snap your fingers, I want X, and you expect the GSI to deliver that, right? But you don't really appreciate the work that goes behind the scenes at the GSI to get you what you want. And that's where I guess, I've learned a lot as well on the other side of the table, is really appreciating actually when I just flick my fingers at client, I'm not, the client really doesn't understand how much work is involved in delivering that behind the scenes from a GSI perspective. So I miss that, the days of when I just used to be able to click and say, can I have X, and wait for a few weeks, and suddenly appears and I can test, not really caring about, who's built it, how many hours of blood, sweat and tears has gone into this. So yeah, I miss that bit, because I'm now on the other side of having to actually deliver something to a client.
Totally get that.
Yeah.
How about testing? What are your thoughts around testing? Because so you were as an end client with a large customer, and one of the things that I found is a lot of clients underestimate the testing part of things. So how did you manage testing in yours? It sounds like since there was a lot of planning that went in, testing is something that you probably thought about as well. So what made it really successful?
Yeah, testing was a core element of our sprints as well. So we actually built our sprints around having enough time to test those sprints and what was delivered in those sprints, and a full end-to-end UAT at the end as well. And again, it's down to Imperial recognizing that they needed to make the investment both from a resources point of view, so freeing up people from the business to come along and test. So you know how I talked about having those end users in those workshops, those were our testers. So they were the ones that helped to create the user story. They should know what they're testing for and come up with the test scenarios. And at the end of each sprint, you know, we had a week or two of at least UAT and being able to sort of, you know, raise defects, you know, if there were defects, or refining those, what was delivered because somebody had misunderstood the requirement maybe. So yeah, you know, we did put a lot of time and effort and investment into UAT. Again, it's a challenge with a lot of clients because the value of testing, in my view, in projects is seen as relatively low. Yeah, people don't really attach much value to that. They expect the system integrator to take on that aspect of the project, saying, well, surely it's the GSI's problem to test this application. And the client misses the point because it's not the GSI's problem, it's a joint problem. It's the GSI's problem to test and unit test what they've built, but really it's the business's problem to test the actual thing works as expected end to end. And one of the things that I did when we were running UATs from a business perspective was, yes, we had test scripts. We had, you know, people used to run through a cycle, press X, press Y, press Z. Do you get the result? Yes or no? And that's all very prescriptive. But what we used to build into our UAT at the end of the UAT is a couple of days where I just used to give the application what we built to end users and put them in a room and get them lots of cakes and snacks. And I said, right, do whatever you want. What, you know, try and break this for me. I'm not going to give you a script. I just want you to play around with the data. I just want you to start a call, end a call, you know, create activities, blah, blah, blah. And I just want you to try and do whatever you would do when you're out on the road, you know, try and break it for me. And you'll be amazed, actually, we picked up a lot of the bugs in those 2 days than what we did through prescriptive testing. Yeah, just letting people loose with it, because people will do some really weird things when you give them an application. They'll move from one screen to another or try to do something in a different process or a different way, and they'll raise that as a defect. And actually that triggers another, oh, well, actually, we didn't think of that, because there might be other people that may actually think like him or her and you know, interpret that process differently. So to me, the value of testing has two things. One, yes, you know, you've got to have prescriptive testing so you can audit and, you know, tick off, yes, you know, that does work as we expected, as per the user story, as per the process. But I think there's also an element of testing, which I think businesses need to recognize, is just give the people the application for a couple of days and let them loose with it and see what they find. Because that to me is unstructured testing, but actually that does raise a lot of issues that you'd never thought would come out through structured testing. Because no matter how good you are at planning testing, you cannot conceivably think about every single scenario out there that an end user is going to go through.
So there are two things there that I was just like marked it in my head. One is around methodology, which we'll get to. That's like one of my favorite subjects. The other one is where just to provide context and probably nuance for anyone listening in, when you say raise a defect, I like the fact that you're looking at it from a different, a quite a holistic point of view, because I think one of the challenges that we get in our lives when we're doing projects for clients is testing is such a can be a contentious period, because it becomes a blame game. This thing doesn't work, it's your fault because you didn't build it right, or it's not our fault because you didn't tell us what you really wanted. So testing period can be quite a wobbly emotional roller coaster. But I like the fact that how you've approached it. So I just want to just clarify, when you say defect, what you mean in the context of that role that you had is this particular thing isn't doing what we would like it to do. And perhaps what comes out is a change request, I guess, in our language would be a change of the original requirements because we didn't think about it.
Correct.
As opposed to this isn't working because you built it wrong.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So precisely, and I think you've summed it up nicely there, Pei, because I think there's the element of where you think about test scenarios, test scripts, whatever you call them. They're all the same, where you go through a prescriptive process of testing what you've built, and you get an end user to do the same from their perspective, and that will give you a baseline of, yes, it does work against the original requirement. But who says, like you say, the original requirement is right until you give it to an end user? Because they might go through a different process. So step 3 becomes step 5, and they've done something slightly different. And the chances are, 50% of the people out there are going to do the same. And we haven't catered for that scenario. Now, that scenario didn't come out in the workshops, right? Because we had a limited representation of the business. You can't have every single user in a workshop, right? You're going to have 1 or 2, and those guys didn't come up with that slight process change. But the fact is, now you've given it, and sort of people are messing around with it. Yeah, it's raised a defect. It's not a true defect because everything is, working as per the design, but it's actually another scenario that we never thought of, that we need to actually consider. Because if we don't consider, we're going to get, 50 support calls on day 1 because it's not working as it should be, not through no fault of anybody, but just we hadn't considered that scenario. So those things did come up in that unstructured testing I was talking about. That's a great forum to bring people in, to just let them do freeform testing, because you're never going to pick that sort of stuff up through a structured UAT.
Correct. I like the approach that you took, because that's, I think, what a lot of clients should look at implementation of projects more like a team effort between the partner and the client, to look at what would be the best kind of solution for the project, and not a demarcated experience, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's so much more I want to get into, Mo. It really is. I was wondering if you'd be open to doing a part 2 with me at some point. Yes?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Love to.
I think we've just really scratched the surface. I really enjoyed listening to your journey, and especially around how you've used Salesforce to transition to a new environment from end customer, and a lot of the lessons that come out of that. I would like to unpack that a little bit more, and we'll do it in part 2. So thank you so much for your time today, Mo.
Thank you, Pei. I look forward to another session with you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.